Buenos días a todos y todas. A nombre del director del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, el doctor Lowell Fitz, quien se encuentra de viaje oficial, le agradecemos su presencia en este acto. A nombre del personal docente, no docente y estudiantes ayudantes del Caribe, le damos la más cordial bienvenida y le agradecemos estar aquí. Le recordamos en Facebook. Esta es la 16ª edición de las Conferencias Caribeñas que comenzaron en el 2007 y se han celebrado 2007 eventos de forma consecutiva, incluyendo la de esta mañana, que fue la presentación del documental Extinctions in Progress. Las Conferencias Caribeñas son coauspiciadas por la oficina de la decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, doctora Dharma Guardiola, la Biblioteca Regional del Caribe, que Almaluces está allá mirándonos desde la ventana del cristal. Y este evento se por el portal del Recinto, UPRRP.edu, gracias a la cortesía de la Rectoría, que le queremos agradecer también un presupuesto para estas conferencias. Para esta conferencia contamos con el coauspicio del Departamento de Biología de Ciencias Naturales y agradecemos al doctor Turbay Giray, su director, que aceptara nuestra invitación, y al doctor Eugenio Santiago, su colaboración en la planeación del evento. En la entrada hay una exhibición de nuestra revista Caribbean Estudios, la única revista del recinto en estar en JSTOR, la más importante base de datos. También está en Project Muse y en Wilson. Nos honra darle la bienvenida al doctor Blair Hedges, director del Centro de Biodiversidad y profesor Laura H. Carnell de Temple University, quien compartirá con nosotros ahora la conferencia Solving Biological Questions with Historical Maps of Caribbean Islands. Su presentación estará a cargo del doctor Richard Thomas, zoólogo y especialista en anfibios y reptiles del Departamento de Biología. Ahora le solicito a Richard que venga para acá y a ustedes que por favor apaguen sus celulares y se identifiquen en el momento de pregunta y respuesta. Muchas gracias.
I don't know how many of you saw the film, the movie that that Dr. Hedges showed this morning, but if you did, you saw the sorts of activities that that Dr. Hedges has been engaged in for many years, and this involves turning over rocks, raking palm trash. Going out at night in some truly remote areas and looking for all kinds of animals. The results of this over the past 30 years or so has been the description of an enormous contribution to the knowledge of the herpetofauna of the West Indies, and this involved the description of many species from islands from the Lesser Antilles throughout the Greater Antilles and almost anywhere that in the West Indies. His contribution has been enormous, and you can go on. He even has a website for identifying species in his Carib herp, which is great. Those of you some of you who've taken herpetology from me probably have visited that site. Anyway, it's been my pleasure over the years to have gone along on some of these field trips, and we've been different places, and and it's been quite an experience. And one of the things that surprised me quite a bit is that Dr. Hedges became interested in old maps and started collecting them and started thinking about them, and along the way developed techniques for aging some of these very old maps that go back years. And this most recent aspect I'm pretty much unfamiliar with, so I'm looking forward to see what his presentation, how he is using old maps to solve biological problems. So it should be very interesting. And with so I give you Dr. Hedges.
Okay, thank you for listening to me again, some of you who were here earlier. What I'm going to do today is just, and I realize there was a delay, a technical delay, and I think I can make up some time so I don't keep you too much over. But I'm just going to talk about this large collection of maps, digital maps that have been scanned, that contain a wealth of history that can be used for not only historical questions but for biological questions. The questions and mysteries that I've addressed recently in this area. So this is, as Richard pointed out, well, this is a database. It's called CariMap. I'll talk about that. It has 1,800 maps scanned. So there's this concept of toponym time. A toponym is a name, a place name, like Puerto Rico is a toponym. And so I've looked at things like that and through history. And when you have a few maps, and of course, most historians are not necessarily trained in statistics. Because I'm a scientist, I'm trained in statistics, and so I'm approaching it a little bit differently. And since I have a large number of these things, I'm using statistics to analyze it in I think a little different way. And then I'll talk about some biological problems that I solved using my own database in this method, and then some cartographic questions which I think are interesting. Just a side note, this is CariMap that I'll be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so, and then Richard mentioned is a database of amphibians and reptiles, and then Care of Nature is kind of an outreach site with video essays, now mostly Haiti, different languages. And CariPerp, you can see all the amphibians and reptiles of the Caribbean, the photos and maps, and I'm not going to talk about that now. I'll just let you know it exists. Care has these video essays that we made. I won't mention that any more than just showing it in the slide here, but we'll focus on this one. So what this is it's a collection of map scans, but they're high resolution, so they're about 10,000 pixels by 10,000 pixels, which is a lot of data. The reason being, and if you focus on, say, this is Cuba here. This is an old map from 1635. If you focus on that, you basically zoom in, not just like that, but get close enough to this one little part of Cuba to read names. So you can actually read toponyms, which most images of maps you can't do, because this is 100 megapixels. So your average camera is like 3 to 5 megapixels, and if you have a 5D Mark III you paid a few $1,000s for, you can do 21 megapixels. So this is 100 megapixels. This is very high scanned images, and the reason being is so it was to see these place names, because that's where a lot of the history is, in these place names. And so that, and what the database looks like, and I could pull it up, but basically there are 1,800 maps, more or less, and the different islands. You click on an island, and then you get in this little slider that you can pull across all the maps chronologically arranged from that island. Probably pull it up, I'll try in a second, and then some other additional information, Caribbean maps, Google Earth, and also topographic maps. So I have all of the topographic maps of Haiti in very high resolution. So for example, if you're working in Haiti, you can go right here, right to an index map, and find which map, and also Dominican Republic. I don't have topographic maps of every island. I'm getting to that point. And I started out making these video essays. This one is of Jamaica. Let me see. I might come back to it. Anyway, they're little 3 to 5 minute video essays, and this is a Google map, Google Earth tour of, in this case, Jamaica. And it's like if you were flying around the coastline, zooming in on different points of interest, talking about that, narrating it. And so it's a little video, and it gives people, you know, I talk about the cartographic history, the history of the island, so it introduces people to an island. And a lot of people go to Jamaica on vacation, and so thousands of people have viewed this little essay, which is good to see. And all of these sites are programmed so they fit on an iPhone or an Android or whatever device you have. I have some apps for iPhones, but actually mobile web programming is even better, because then you don't have to update the app. It's updated once. I'm sorry, I'll get closer to the mic. So anyway, so you can look at it on your device, you know, a tablet or whatever, laptop. And the software that I use is a freeware from Microsoft. They make available to programmers. And this, it cost Microsoft a lot of money. They bought a company that developed this. It's called Sea Dragon, and I think they paid $20 million or something like that for this program. And now they give it away free. But it allows you to zoom in on the images without bogging down is a big problem. So you're only seeing the pixels. You're only loading the pixels that you want to see. So as I mentioned, these are very high resolution scans, almost all of them. Students over the years helped me with the scanning of maps. So I collected a lot of these old maps. Maybe a third of them are ones that I have. I stopped collecting because it's an endless thing. And then I've gotten from libraries around the world scans. And I correspond with the librarians and who are already familiar with the database. Like Stanford had a huge number of scans, and they were already well aware of the database, and they very nicely made available hundreds and hundreds of scans on a big external drive and sent them to me. They don't normally do that, but and of course on the database I use them and cite Stanford University, so they get credit. And very recently, I'm doing some scientific historical analysis with the map. So I'm using the database as data for actual answering cartographic questions and cartographic questions especially. And Sarah Hansen, who's been to Haiti with me, is my GIS assistant, and she's done a lot of this work with me. And so what we developed is this concept of a toponym timeline. And you can't really do this unless you have hundreds and hundreds of maps. So then once you have a large sample, you kind of are in the realm of science and statistics. And so what this shows is that in the Caribbean especially, it's very interesting, because here the history of maps goes back 500 years, much more than any other place in the New World. And so it shows how a place name like Puerto Rico has been used for 500 years. And while I've been talking, you're probably seeing this. So, and I think most of you are aware that this island was called San Juan first, after St. John the Baptist. And so now we know San Juan as a city, but the whole island initially, that was the intention forever. It was San Juan. Puerto Rico, of course, Puerto is port, and that's one location, so that was San Juan, was Puerto Rico, or Bridgeport. And of course, you know, the Amerindian name Boriken has been there as well on maps. So these are what I'm showing. Each little black dot is a map, and what is on that map for the island that we now call Puerto Rico. So as you can see, for the first 150 years of the history of this island, it was called San Juan. And then something interesting happened. For the next 300 years, the island was called Puerto Rico. And you would think, well, that's Portuguese. What's going on? Where's the Portuguese influence in Puerto Rico? There actually isn't. There's very little Portuguese influence. That was a mistake, apparently. I'm tracking down the origin of the mistake, but I think it happened in the mid-1500s. I have there's a little discussion of this elsewhere, but I'm trying to get the exact moment that the mistake was made, but it was literally a mistake in spelling, and then it was corrected in the 1900s to Puerto Rico. I think a lot of you might probably already know this. So now we use this current spelling since the early 1900s. So in this respect, you can see the history of a place name and how at some points in time, for example, in the 1700s and 1800s, this island went by Puerto Rico on all the maps. So, so now, for a few minutes, I'm going to talk about 3 biological mysteries that using this sort of analysis. And this relates to a group of lizards, one species of which occurs on Puerto Rico. It's fairly rare. I've actually never seen it. I've been collecting in Puerto Rico a lot. Dr. Thomas has seen a few of them, but it's not a very common one. But they're skinks, and they've been severely threatened by this mammal that was introduced in the late 1800s, the mongoose. So now we know from genetic analysis and morphology that there are about 40 species of these skinks in the Caribbean. There used to be, a few years ago, there was only like 1 major species and a few others. So I'll talk about 3 species that involved looking at maps to solve the problems. And that study involved genetics, the resolution of the species. I won't talk about that. And this is just a graph showing how you can also measure scales and see differences among species. So that was a study we did a couple years ago that sorted out all the species. But what I'm going to focus on is how the maps came into play, how we use maps. And so the first mystery is of a lizard that is from Harvard, Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, and it's a single animal of what we determined to be a different species, unique in the Caribbean. The question is, where the heck is it from? Because it was reported in this paper here by a researcher that it was from Santo Domingo in 1899, and F. Wineland is the collector. That was it. Just this one spell. I'll talk about the other one in a second. That's the second mystery. So who was Wineland? Was he in Santo Domingo in 1859? And is this a unique species? I just told you we already know it's a unique species, but based on morphology, here it is here. It's not the best condition, but after all, it's 150 years in alcohol, and it was 1858 collected. But it had some little baby skinks, and they provided data as well. So here is the collector Wineland, a German zoologist, and this is when he lived, and he only visited the New World in one place, Jeremy, Haiti, not Santo Domingo. Santo Domingo is the capital of the Dominican Republic, and he gave the specimens. So, I mean, I had a strong hunch this was the case, so it turned out in the 1800s, the entire island of Hispaniola was called Saint Dominique, or San Domingo, or Santo Domingo. And something I noticed, I've been coming to Puerto Rico 30 years ago, and the one thing I noticed is that many Puerto Ricans, when they say Santo, they actually mean the whole island. And I was like, but that's a city, it's not the whole island. And I was always confused by that. And what it is, it's this historical influence that's still maintained today of, you know, what that place name means. So anyway, these are maps from the 1800s. And you can see also Haiti. Haiti applied to the whole island as well. And so if you do a toponym timeline of the island of Hispaniola, what you see is the Santo Domingo or San Domingo was used primarily in the 1700s and the 1800s, but pretty much ended by the early 1900s. And you can see, again, each one of these little black dots is a map. So there were almost 800 maps of Hispaniola that were used in this analysis, a large number of maps. And interestingly, Hispaniola, which is what we call it today, was what Columbus called it. He called it Hispaniola, and that was used for 200 years. Then it was mostly Santo Domingo. Jump back to Hispaniola today. So by looking at this, the critical 1858, and by 1858 it was mainly Santo Domingo or Haiti, and then it made sense that when it was collected, even though it was from Jeremy, Haiti, it was called Santo Domingo because it came from that island. And unfortunately at Harvard, I don't know if it's corrected, but the GIS coordinates are for the city of Santo Domingo for that specimen, and everybody's interpreted it as the city of Santo Domingo incorrectly. That really threw off the science. So actually, instead of here, it was collected 500 kilometers to the west. So that just gives you, and by the way, we named it Haiti, specifically to emphasize it was from Haiti. But that shows you how, you know, looking at these old maps, you can figure out things that were really confused considerably in the science. This is the old of this species that's known. It's probably extinct now from the mongoose. So the second mystery also ties to this same entry here, but it's also the same island, Hispaniola, but it's a different species. Now this one actually is from Santo Domingo. We know that because, again, it's confusing. It says Ciudad Trujillo, mentioned multiple times in the paper, but those of you who know anything about the history of the Dominican Republic see the person meant Ciudad Trujillo after the dictator Trujillo, and so it was a misspelling multiple times. It was confusion, but that's okay. So Trujillo was another name. The dictator's name, he called the city Santo Domingo Ciudad Trujillo for a short period of time, even though it was Santo Domingo before and after his reign, dictatorship. There were still. Now we know it's from the true city of Santo Domingo, but who is this person who collected it? Because nobody's ever seen it again. Here's a lizard that we know to be unique, and the odd thing is, it's from the middle, or it's from a city, a big city, and not from anywhere out in the remote area. So what is going on? And so I wanted to find out the collector, and also was the collector in the Dominican Republic. So it turned out, well, I already mentioned this. This is the dictator, and so here's the lizard. Actually, it's a pair of lizards, and one of them had some young, so it built up a little sample size. But there was one collection event in 1937 by a graduate student at the University of Michigan who was not a herpetologist. He was an entomologist. Telephone and called somebody there, and who had the field notes of this person. And this is really important to have field notes logged. So he read over the telephone, you know, the field notes, and sure enough, it indicated he stayed at this Palace Hotel in Santo Domingo for 2 days in 1937 between point A and point. There's the only time he ever was in the Dominican Republic. And the curator at Michigan said the names of the other species that were collected by this person, and they were all species known only from the Dominican Republic. So I pretty much confirmed that these lizards were from the Dominican Republic. And the trouble is there's no hotel by that name now. And historical question, and I consulted with historians in Santo Domingo, and I was talking with Humberto about one of them earlier, and who helped out. They went through, very kindly, these historians went through newspapers, and they found this Palace Hotel. It existed for a short period of time, right around the late 1930s to the 1940s, and then was destroyed. But so these are newspaper articles, hotel. So I knew exactly where it was located. Because I mean, here's a lizard that nowhere else in the world is known except for this city block or this little area in the city. I'd like to go there and, you know, see if it's still there. Well, here it is on a recent map, and it's in the old part of the city, and it's near this park. And here's the historical area that it's close by to. And then back in old maps of the city, this is a map from, you know, 1683. There's the location of where that was collected. And here's a area that later became a park, a fortress. And here it is again in 1755. And here it is in 1805. That's where the Palace Hotel eventually was later. And there's this fortress area. Unfortunately, nobody's found another one. I've looked. We just can't find another one. It could be extinct. But the question then is, well, the locality's solved. We know exactly where that comes from. Is it a unique species? Yes. Not the genetics, but the morphology says it's unique. But why the heck was it from a big city and nowhere else? Well, as it turns out, the mammal that has wiped out all of these lizards around the Caribbean, a lot of them, and snakes as well, other reptiles, is this Indian mongoose. And that is all over the islands. However, it avoids cities because of this reason. The dogs are in the cities, and the dogs will eat those. That's like one of the few things that keeps this mongoose in check. And so the last specimens of many reptiles in the Caribbean are only known in cities like Kingston, Jamaica, now has the last populations of a very rare lizard, probably because of the dogs in Kingston. So that's likely why this lizard was found only in the city. So now to sum it up, we named this one Mabuya hispanioli after the island. We're not sure whether it was all over the island. It almost certainly had a wider distribution, even though it was only found in that one place. So then the last mystery is this one involving a lizard in Guadeloupe. And this one, here's Guadeloupe in the Lesser Antilles. You probably recognize the shape. And in this case, this turned out to be a unique species in our analysis. There are no living specimens, but this is 3 specimens collected by one person at one time, an ornithologist, not a herpetologist, on the island of Guadeloupe, no specific locality. And it's very clear they all look the same, and they're all different from other things around Guadeloupe. So we really want to know where it was found. So I did a little map research and others. So is it a unique species? Yes. But where in Guadeloupe is it from? Nowadays we call this Vasse-Terre and this Grande-Terre, and the whole island is Guadeloupe. And these are including these peripheral islands. So here was the person, Charles B. Corey. He did his work in the late 1800s, and he collected many birds in the Caribbean, and he happened to collect these 3 lizards along with the birds. So we wanted to know, I immediately asked if there were any notes, and they said, at Chicago, they said, no notes. So then I had to do more research on the maps, and as I said, today we call this whole thing Guadeloupe. This is a map actually from 1902, so it's been a long time it's been called Guadeloupe. But in the late 1800s, this was called Guadeloupe. This island, even though it's connected, was called Basse-Terre. So Guadeloupe meant something different cartographically when this person worked. And what it meant was this person collected not on the whole island, but on this island. And it made a lot of sense to me because I had another species that was from this part of. If you know Guadeloupe, this is the flat, dry part of the island. This is the tall, wet one with the volcanoes. So very different physiographically. And it makes sense that there's a species here which is different from the one here. So I really like to hear that because it made sense. So looking at the maps and the names solved that question, and also looking at the toponym timeline, we see that in the 1700s, in the 1800s, well, the 1700s, the island was called Basse-Terre, but in the 1800s, Basse-Terre was mostly called Guadeloupe, and as I showed you on that map. But then by the mid-1900s, early 1900s, it became Basse-Terre again. So for the last 60, 80 years, Guadeloupe has always meant the entire island. And sure enough, I found a publication by this person, and he illustrated a map at the end of this publication where he indicated Guadeloupe and then Grande Terre, separate. And another interesting thing is that in the time period in the late 1800s when he visited Guadeloupe, there was, the main capital was Basse-Terre, so there were no airplanes. And these maps show shipping routes, which is very useful. And it showed the shipping and passenger ferries went to Basse-Terre, not to Grande Terre, whereas today the capital is Pointe-à-Pitre on Grande Terre. So everything indicated that the specimen came from Basse-Terre. And so here it is here. It's a darker species, which you would associate with more humidity in a wetter part of the island. Here are the other species around the island. So that all makes sense. So those are three mysteries, biological mysteries that were solved by reference to these old maps, which was very exciting. And then the last few things I'm going to talk about before I finish, I just want to mention some cartographic things of interest that you can see with these toponym timelines. For example, in the Bahamas, the Bahamas were called the Lucayas at some point in time before they were the Bahamas. Here they were here they're the Bahama Islands. And if we look at the toponym timeline, we see that in the late 1600s, the use of Bahamas started increasing. By the way, this dark line is a mean, and these are the 95% error bars. So we're talking statistics you can do with a large sample of this, in this case, 600 maps. But since the 1900s, we've used the word Bahamas entirely for all the maps. So you can see how there's like a transition period over almost 150, 200 years of the usage of a toponym. Something that you really can't say, you know, in the classic historical analysis, which doesn't use statistics, it's a little less accurate. But here you can literally visually see how things change in history, historical usage. And I think this is the last major point I want to make, and that is a really interesting set of toponyms involves the Lesser Antilles. And these are the Leeward and the Windward Islands of the Caribbean. Very, very confusing names to everyone for hundreds. And I see people smile. This was a real fun one to work on because of that. It's very complex. But for example, this map from 1760 illustrates the complexity quite well. Here the Lesser Antilles are called the Caribe Islands. That's what they were at one time. And then you have the little islands that are off South America, you know, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao. The Windward Islands mostly have been in the same location. That would be the southern Lesser Antilles. But here the Leeward Islands include Puerto Rico and part of Hispaniola, and of course the Virgin Islands. So very different from today. Here's one from 1920 that shows the Leeward Islands, the Windward Islands, the Lesser Antilles. So this one here, starting in 1920, is very close to what we consider today the names of the islands. And here's some more examples. Here would be the Lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands, Windward. This is the Leeward now again. the leeward, instead of the little Antilles, now we're calling these the Leeward Islands. And the location, now here is another one. The Windward Islands start way up at Montserrat, St. Kitts, instead of down at Dominica. So the actual location defining the Windward and the Leeward changes with time. So let's look at some toponym timelines. So here is some maps call the whole thing the Antilles. That was very early on in the late 1500s. But then the Caribe Islands, don't see at all. Most of you have probably never heard of the Caribe Islands, but they were on maps throughout most of the 500-year history of the Caribbean. The Lesser Antilles were the Caribes into the early 1900s. Then the Windward Islands were used for the entire Lesser Antilles in probably a quarter of all maps over the time period. And then finally the Lesser Antilles, what we call them today, were used for those islands that we recognize as the Lesser Antilles today for only really the last 100 years. Now, I say Lesser Antilles locational. That means if you focus on location of islands, what were those islands called? That's a little bit different question rather than what was the toponym called. So here's the location. If we say what were the southern islands called? Well, the southern islands were called, southern islands being south of Dominica. They were called the Lesser Antilles during this period. Then they were the eastern, what were the eastern islands called? Well, they were called the Lesser Antilles a little bit later. Then what we call today the Lesser Antilles are all the eastern islands and the ones off of South America coast. And that is pretty much in the last 100 years, 150 years. And so, not to dwell on this too much, but just to point out that if you look at the Leeward Islands and you actually break it down to kind of reverse it and say what were the Virgin Islands plus to St. Kitts called? Well, during this period they were called the Leeward Islands. What were the Northern Lesser Antilles plus Virgin Islands plus Puerto Rico called? Well, in this period in the 1700s they were called the Leeward Islands, and also a little bit in the 1800s, you know, and so forth. I don't want to go through it because it's going to bore you to each one, but just to show you there's a great diversity of name usage in the Caribbean for Leeward, Windward, Lesser Antilles, and all that, and so forth. So, so you can see you can ask the question in many different ways. And here's another, I'll just point out, so if we assume that we have a Leeward Islands and a Windward Islands, where's the break? Well, if the break is between Guadeloupe and Montserrat, then it was on maps during this period. If it was between St. Lucia and Martinique, it was during this period on maps. And you can see most of the maps had the break south of Dominica. So that kind of dominant break, but you can see it's used in different ways. So what is this business about what is Leeward and Windward anyway? Well, Leeward and Windward refers to the wind in sailing. And so Windward would be where the wind is coming from. Leeward is where the wind is going to. And sometimes it's used a little bit differently in navigation. That's the usual meaning for naming islands, because you can name Leeward and Windward Islands, for example, on the Cape Verde Islands, they have Leeward and Windward. So that's not just the Caribbean. The trouble is, if you look at the air currents, they're kind of all over the place in the Caribbean. They're mostly from the northwest, northeasterlies, but they change, and they change with seasons. And so during certain times of the year, the Lesser Antilles, the wind comes from different angles from the southeast. For example, the currents come from the south, and sometimes the winds do too. So they're not unidirectional. So the best names for these islands are, this is my recommendation here, the Northern Lesser Antilles and the Southern Lesser Antilles. Everybody knows what north and south is, and you don't have to worry about, you know, like which way the wind's blowing. It's the north and the south, and that would be nice in the future if maps would have that. And I've actually traced down the process of getting map names changed. Believe it or not, there is a process. It involves the United Nations, and there's a in the Netherlands who's like the head of all place names in the world. And so I've corresponded with him. It would be great if you could email him and tell him to change the names. There's a little lengthy process and some forms and signatures, and I'm just kidding. It's a lengthy process, and they have to discuss it, and unlikely unless a lot of nations agree, and so, but there is a process. And and one final thing I should mention, that there are many mountains in the Caribbean, since I'm on toponyms, that have no names, big mountains. And when I've been doing, like I talked about this morning, we've encountered these maps that have species that are only on this mountaintop. And what do we call it? Because in a scientific paper, we have to give it a name. We landed on this mountain X. So it turns out you can name mountains that are unnamed, and if you talk to the right historians and do things, you can actually, it's a name, it's something that can be integrated into maps in the future. So we named one of them Frog Mountain in French, Morne Grenouille, and another one Lizard Mountain, Morne Lizard. That was where that old that Darlington the twig in the movie. But anyway, it's kind of nice to give some biodiversity, you know, to the place names of these places. So important for biodiversity. This is Morne Grenouille, and you can see not much going on there. There's a little forest on the other side, but these beautiful animals, and so it's very appropriate that it's named Frog Mountain. And just to conclude, I think in the future you're going to see historical analysis, which is really what I'm talking about. You're going to see map databases larger than what I have, and you're going to see metadatabases where they build on other databases, and probably increased use of map scans and statistics, quantitative historical cartography, you could call it. I think I'm finding that this thing we're doing, which we call toponym timelines, is very useful for looking at place names. And you can also do other interesting things, like look how shape of an island like Puerto Rico, the shape of Puerto Rico has changed through time. You can do that with quantitative information. And I mean, changed through time on maps, of course. And hopefully it hasn't changed. Anyway, and topographic timelines as well when sea level changes. So I think it's an exciting area that's really hasn't been explored very much, and I thank you for inviting me to talk about this interesting area, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hedges, for a very fascinating lecture. I have three comments, comments. Hispaniola must be one of the most difficult ones, especially in the 19th century, because Haiti invaded the Dominican Republic, and they were on 1822 to 1844, and Santo Domingo became Dominican Republic. The first part of the century is very complicated. So things get clear after 1844 in reality. That first part of the century does have, I don't know, the map makers must have been crazy trying to make sense of it. Then in terms of islands that change owners, metropolitan owners, I was thinking of Vieques and Crab Island, and if you have any comments on that. And thinking about Vieques, I was thinking Vieques as a field of scientific study in your own field. They have sugarcane, the military practices. Have there been any research on that?
On the island of Vieques?
Vieques and Crab Island.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize, but I actually haven't paid particular attention to that island. I think the information is there, but we started out focusing on the big place names we also did the Caribbean, and there's a sea in the Western Caribbean. But you can all what we did for Vieques and some of the smaller islands. We just haven't done it, and I apologize. I can't answer that question because I didn't look at that. But it would be very interesting. I think it's wide open for all that, and anybody actually could do that because all this database is completely online, free. In fact, my assistant Sarah, the GIS, she literally used the database on the web and went through the maps to score these names, and so anybody could, so I welcome anyone to do that. But yeah.
And then the last comment will be on your Lesser Antilles attempt. Well, it seems that the contemporary record is Eastern Caribbean. You have the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States.
Yeah.
That's the term that they decided that they're going to use. And even from the British Virgin Islands down. So what do you think about them adopting the Lesser Antilles? And a historical comment, the photo you had with Carnell and Breton in Santo Domingo in the Palace Hotel. Yeah. It's a fascinating one because Breton was coming, fleeing from Europe.
Yeah.
And he stopped in Martinique first, yeah. met Césaire, and discovered Césaire's work in Césaire, and then went to Dominican Republic and eventually to New York. Yes.
I thought that you would probably know some history about that newspaper article, and which was completely secondary to why I showed it, but it had some interesting personalities, and thank you for pointing that out. And about the trouble with the Lesser Antilles and this Eastern Caribbean states is that you have the former British islands, which I go to a lot, and the former both, and they are like completely different. And the trade and getting the two to agree on anything, I don't see that ever happening, honestly. but it would be good if it happened.
I think that Levins and Heatwall, and also Levins, Heatwall, and Beyer went to the British Virgins and a couple others and named themselves some islands. And my understanding is that some of those names they didn't do anything official, as I understand it, were kept on that. I wonder if either you or Richard or somebody can say anything about that.
I'm not familiar with, but yeah, there are many. In the Caribbean, thousands of islands, Bahamas, thousands, and I'm sure there are many unnamed ones. And that's how names start. Somebody has to say, "I name it X," and then there's a document published, and then somebody looks up what's the name of the island, and they find that document that's published, and so on and so forth, and then it gets, so a lot of it happens that way. But there are official channels, like I mentioned, where you can petition, Historical Society of Dominican Republic. So I looked into this in the Dominican Republic, and because there's some mountains in southern Dominican Republic that also don't have name. It's north of the Sierra de Neiva. Is a whole range, and Richard and I have a new species of lizard on that range, and I wanted to use a name, and so it turns out there's no real name for that mountain, but we haven't pursued that process yet, but there is a process, and it's not that hard, but yeah.
My question, Eugenio Santiago from Biology. My question is the opposite, not a place that doesn't have a name, yeah, but a name that you probably have. For instance, there are in the historical collection of plants, for instance, and I'm sure for amphibians and reptiles, there might be places that are very important in the collecting record, and sometimes it's very hard to find out where exactly that place is right now because possibly the name is not already in use.
Yeah.
Have you come across some of these, or can you give examples in Haiti or anywhere that you have worked with?
Yeah, that was the whole reason why I started the CARA map. What you just said was because we were finding names that don't exist anymore of cities like in Cuba, little towns in Cuba, and so these old maps have those names, and so that's one really good use. The problem is now you can't search. It's very hard to search a digital image that has palm trees as little, and reds and blacks, and yet it's very hard to take and extract text information from a digital image, just pixels. But there are programs that do that, and as they become more sophisticated, then we will have a huge number of these toponyms that can be searchable. You can do like, I want to have a CARA map where you can just do a search for toponyms on the maps. That would be the next thing, and I think it's possible.
I'm Professor Giusti from the History Department, and I teach Caribbean history.
Oh.
Very interested in your research. Right. I had come across your database, I think a couple of years ago, but I hadn't gone back to it recently, and I didn't realize the scope of it and the great resolution that your maps have. You know, there's a number of different sources of Caribbean maps in the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are private map dealers
Mm-hmm.
that allow you to even download maps and so forth. So I was kind of, I lost my way around some of those sources. I was doing some searches for the class.
Mm-hmm.
And now I realize how useful your database is, and I definitely will be using it. One of the things we were interested in class was the name of the Caribbean vis-a-vis West Indies. And as you point out, the Caribbean islands
Mm-hmm.
were long used, are not used in recent times, and actually are apparently the name for the wider use of Caribbean for the region. First the Caribbean islands, then the Caribbean Sea, and then eventually the region, and displacing to some extent West Indies.
Mm-hmm.
My specific questions have to do with a couple of things. One is the cartographic traditions. You mentioned Puerto Rico being the name being switched to Puerto Rico. That's a pretty obvious contrast. In the Spanish tradition, it remained Puerto Rico all the time. It never changed to Puerto Rico. You'd have to, in the French, it did change to Puerto Rico fairly early on for reasons that would be interesting to pin down. You say it had to do with misspelling, perhaps also with greater recent pronunciation. In Spanish, Puerto Riqueño is actually not the most correct use in Spanish. It would be Puerto Riqueño if you go to kind of a strict grammatical usage. It's interesting how the Puerto and Puerto happened, but definitely in the Spanish maps it always remained. The cartographic tradition becomes more complicated in your use of quantitative data, because if you add numbers, I find fascinating, and following the variable use of names, you have to take into account that you're combining French cartographic traditions, Dutch, English, Spanish, Dutch, German sometimes even. So how those names flowed through the different cartographic traditions is important, because they're not following the same usages at the same time, and there are certain patterns that you can see. For example, the Caribbean was known as part of the Gulf of Mexico for a very long time. In some of those traditions, more than others, the sea wasn't identified separately from the Gulf of Mexico. So those differences between traditions would be important to pin down. And also, some maps were more widely used, read, and had a greater influence than others. So the quantitative part has to somehow work into the differences in the impact that one name or another had. finally, my last point has to do with leewards and windwards. We were talking about that in our last class, actually, and I was going to talk about that today, using some of the same maps that you're using in terms of the wind currents. As you very rightly note, the winds in the Caribbean are mostly from the east and northeast. So in Spanish, they were known as Isla de Barlovento. The whole of the eastern Caribbean, the Lesser Antilles, were known as Islas de Barlovento, windward islands. And the leeward islands are the ones that, in the interesting map that you have, are the Little Antilles, Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire. Those were the leeward islands in Spanish usage, and that remained in Spanish, French, Dutch usage. Those remained Barlovento and Sotavento. The windward islands remained, the whole chain of the were called the Barlovento or windward and leeward, and it makes sense, the wind is coming. So then the English confused things, and I still don't know how what the explanation is for naming them leeward and windward. The closest I've come in the last, just reading about this stuff again in the last few weeks, I think may have to do with the slave trade. And we will have to look, you know, the wind pattern from different times of the year, and we would have to see which times of the year were most where there was more navigation, depending on the non-hurricane seasons and whatnot. And since a lot of the shipping and the slave trade was coming, it was all coming from Africa, but then following kind of close to the continent, close to the South American continent, to go to Barbados with the key. I've read at some point I read that Barbados was like the vantage point, and then the winds coming, the leeward was the islands that were to the leeward of Barbados. And then that would have to do with the importance of Barbados in the 17th century and with the wind currents in the slave trade. But I haven't seen any every time I find an explanation even in geography books about the difference between leeward and windward, no sense. When
exactly,
you take into account this, it's a very funny.
Well, thank you very much. And before you leave the auditorium, I want to get your contact information.
Yes,
obviously you know a lot about this, and that's great. So I think just real briefly, you pointed out the language differences. So you're right about that. Different languages also mean different cultures and interpretations. But we did translate Santo Domingo, Saint Dominique was all Santo Domingo. I mean, so we went across language barriers when we did this, and there are other examples too. But nonetheless, you could easily break it down by languages and analyze it that way too. We didn't notice a big difference. I think the cartographers in the different countries were following the same thing at the same time period. So, but there were interesting differences in countries. But there was you brought up so many interesting points. I can't remember them all, but I do want your email address and contact information. Oh yeah, because this is published. I haven't submitted this anywhere, so it'd be great to get feedback, from you. But Eastern Caribbean, yeah, the lesser means not important. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, that's true. They probably don't like that. Anyway, thanks very much for those comments. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just curious, you had island shape there, and I've often sort of wondered,
yeah,
in terms, you look at the old maps, and obviously, I guess because they made fewer visits or because of technology for measuring angles and or measuring north and south but do you see anything, or were there sudden improvements, or was it sort of gradual improvement over time, or do you have any?
I haven't done the quantitative analysis, but it looks like there were definitely sudden improvements, and they were related to coastline surveys that were done at a certain time where they went along the coast. And so all of a sudden, you know, you'd have like a undefined coast, and then you get a really defined coast. And clearly there was like a mission, you know, a ship went there for this purpose of defining the coastline. That's a lot of work to go through the history and document what ship did that and all, and I don't think I have detail, but I'd like to show animations or whatever, you know, so people can see how the islands have improved in shape up to the present, which is the perfect, you know, knowledge. So, but it happened over time, over, you know, sometimes hundreds of years. Thank you very much for coming, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards.